At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law snatched the scarf off my head and yelled, "Stop faking cancer." People stared at my bald head and laughed. I stood there shaking until a strange man walked forward, put his coat over my head and said 6 words that silenced the entire room. Before I tell you the story, I want to say, if you've ever felt humiliated, powerless, or betrayed by the people closest to you, you're not alone. Please subscribe and stay with me. I promise this story is about resilience, quiet strength, and finding your own dignity when the world seems determined to take it from you. Now let me tell you what really happened that day. The chapel was quiet, too quiet, in that way that makes every step echo, every breath feel loud. I was standing by Daniel's casket, my hands gripping the scarf I'd wrapped around my bald head, the one thing that made me feel like myself in a room full of judgment. And then she did it. Lena, my son's wife. Her hands were sudden and sharp. One tug, and the scarf slipped from my head, and I felt the chill of every gaze in the room. "Stop faking cancer," she screamed. It wasn't the words themselves. They were empty, but the way they cut through the silence, hitting everyone like a slap. People laughed. Not quietly. Not in pity. They laughed as though my grief, my loss, and my sickness were some kind of performance. I froze. My knees threatened to buckle. My hands trembled. I wanted to sink through the floor, or at least hide behind the casket. The sudden warmth of shame rose in my chest, the heat of it burning, almost suffocating. "Lena, stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible, shaky. "She didn't." She smirked at the faces turning toward her, enjoying the attention. Everyone knows the truth, don't they? And they stared. Some were shocked, some whispered behind their hands, and some worse, smiled with judgment. My reflection of Daniel, my Daniel hovered in every memory, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. He wouldn't have let this happen. He always protected me. Then, out of nowhere, someone stepped forward. A man I hadn't noticed until that moment. He was calm, deliberate, and quiet, but every step he took seemed to slow the chaos around him. He draped his coat gently over my shoulders, covering my bare head, shielding me without a word. And then he spoke. 6 simple words that froze the room, that made Lena pause, that made the laughter vanish. She is telling the truth. The words hung there like a bell, ringing in the silence. People turned, eyes wide. Lena's mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came. For a heartbeat, maybe 2, I could only stare, heart hammering, the warmth of tears threatening again. The man stepped back, his coat still around my shoulders. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He had given me what I couldn't give myself in that moment: presence, dignity, a shield against humiliation. I felt my knees steady. My breath slowed, but even as the tension ebbed, I knew this wasn't over. Lena's eyes were fixed on me, a mixture of fury and disbelief. And deep down, I realized that my journey, my quiet, careful reclamation of power, was only just beginning. Because in that chapel, under the weight of stares and whispers, I made a decision. She had humiliated me. Yes, but she would not break me. Not now. Not ever. And somewhere in that moment, a small spark of something dangerous, poetic, and necessary flickered to life. After the funeral, I drove home in a haze. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, the warmth of tears still lingering on my cheeks. The house smelled the way it always did, faint traces of Daniel's favorite coffee blend, the lingering scent of cedar from the living room shelves. Everything should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a gallery of judgment, the walls pressing in, echoing Lena's laughter. I set my keys on the counter and stared at them, as though they might give me a clue on how to navigate this humiliation. The scarf lay folded on the chair, still trembling from the tug, still a symbol of a life someone had tried to strip away from me in front of everyone I had ever known. There was a knock at the door. "Margaret," a familiar voice called. It was Nancy, my neighbor. The one person I trusted to understand the subtle pains of small-town scrutiny. She stepped inside, arms full of freshly baked bread, her eyes soft with concern. I heard about what happened." "Are you okay?" I swallowed my throat tight. "I'm managing," I said, though the lie felt thin, almost laughable. She set the bread on the counter and reached out, brushing my hand with hers. "You don't have to manage alone," she said quietly. "Not anymore. Lena, she's cruel, yes. But cruelty can't last against someone who knows her own worth." Her words settled over me like a bomb, yet they also stirred a slow, uneasy awareness in my chest. Lana hadn't just humiliated me. She'd tested me, pushed me to the edge, and I had survived. My survival suddenly felt like the beginning of something, an unspoken challenge. "I don't know why she hates me so much," I whispered. "Why she had to make me feel this." Nancy tilted her head, her expression gentle but sharp. "Maybe it's not hate, Margaret, maybe it's envy. Or fear. You have something she can't touch, something she doesn't understand." I looked down at my hands, remembering the stranger at the funeral. The man who had draped his coat over me, who had spoken those 6 words. The memory of him lingered, calm and deliberate. And I realized that even amidst my humiliation, there was hope. Someone had seen me. Someone had acknowledged the truth in front of everyone. I wanted to cry again, but instead I felt the first flicker of determination. Lena had thought she could shame me into silence, make me small, erase my dignity. She had underestimated the quiet strength that comes from surviving grief, from holding on to memory and love in a world eager to strip it away. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I'm going to start reclaiming my life. Every small piece. Every corner." "She won't see it coming." Nancy smiled, almost knowingly, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Good. That's exactly how you do it. Quiet, calm, and unstoppable." I nodded, feeling a subtle warmth spread through me, a mixture of sorrow and quiet fury. Lena had her moment, but I would have mine too, and it wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. It would be just. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen with Nancy's comforting presence, I realized something important. Humiliation could be endured, but it could also be transformation, and I would make sure the transformation was hers to witness. After the funeral, I couldn't step into the kitchen without feeling Lena's eyes burning into my back, even though she wasn't there. The house was silent, but every corner seemed alive with her presence, mocking me. I sank into Daniel's old armchair. The leather cracked and familiar, and I felt the weight of everything. The empty air where his laughter should have been, the quiet hum of the refrigerator that used to accompany his morning coffee. My hands shook slightly as I traced the rim of the chipped mug he'd left on the counter. I whispered to myself almost out loud, "Daniel, what would you do?" The answer was a memory, a glance he had given me at one of Lena's early dinners, when she had interrupted me mid-sentence, mocking my opinions. His eyes had said, "I see you. Don't let her define you." I could feel that gaze now, steadying me, like a tether to the person I was before humiliation had been draped over me like a heavy cloak. Lena had wanted me small. She had wanted me trembling and embarrassed, and for a moment I had been. But sitting there, alone, with the faint smell of his cologne in the air, I realized that humiliation could not erase years of love, years of life lived, years of quiet strength. And more than that, I realized I could turn this. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with precision. Quiet moves, calculated, that would let her see the consequences of her cruelty without ever raising my voice. I remembered how he would walk with me through Salem's small streets, holding my hand, letting me take the lead sometimes, letting me feel capable. I can do this, I told myself. I am still capable. And then I noticed the small envelope on the side table, one Daniel had left, addressed to me, written in his careful hand. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was nothing extravagant, just a note for the times you feel powerless. Trust yourself. Always. The words felt like a lifeline. I read them again. Trust yourself. Always. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't realized in years. Power didn't come from other people's approval. It came from memory, from clarity, from the quiet courage that survives even the cruelest moments. I could feel Lena's presence in the room again, imagined, threatening, sharp, and for the first time I smiled slightly. Not a victory smile, not yet, but a spark. She thought she had won. She thought she had humiliated me beyond repair, but she had no idea how patient I could be, how quietly dangerous. Because now, every whispered word, every glance of hers would be carefully observed. Every small misstep she made would be remembered, and I would wait. Patience would be my ally, observation my weapon, and, slowly but surely, I would reclaim everything she tried to steal. The house felt too big, too empty, and yet too full of her. Lena's shadow lingered in every corner, even when she wasn't there. I could still hear the echo of her laughter at the chapel, the sharpness of her words cutting through the quiet like glass. I moved through the room slowly, touching the furniture Daniel had loved, smelling the faint trace of his cologne on the couch cushions, and trying to steady my racing heartbeat. Every detail reminded me of what she had tried to take from me, my dignity, my calm, my sense of being safe in my own home. Then, without warning, the doorbell rang. My stomach tightened. I opened the door to see her, perfectly composed, holding a bouquet of flowers too bright to be innocent. "I thought I'd check on you," she said, her voice silky, dangerous. Her eyes flicked over me, sharp, calculating, as if measuring my weakness. I let the door remain slightly closed, leaning against the frame. "Thank you," I said softly, deliberately calm. My voice held nothing to feed her arrogance. "I'm managing." She stepped closer, lowering her tone, a whisper meant to slice. "That scene at the funeral, people were talking. You looked ridiculous." I let a quiet pause hang, letting her words linger in the air like a blade, and then I met her gaze directly. "I suppose they do," I said slowly, "but the truth doesn't need approval." For a moment I saw something like confusion cross her face, the smallest crack in her perfect mask. She turned abruptly, leaving the flowers on the porch and walking away, each step echoing on the wooden steps like a challenge. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the tight coil of anger and determination inside me unwind slowly. The silence that followed was alive with possibilities. Lena thought she had power over me. She thought a public humiliation could make me small, but she had underestimated something she couldn't touch. Patience, observation, quiet, deliberate strength. I moved through the house with new attention, checking locks, adjusting curtains, straightening photographs, small acts that reclaimed a sense of control. Every motion felt purposeful, a silent message to her, though she would not know it yet. I could almost imagine her noticing the calm certainty in my steps, frustrated that I didn't respond with fear or anger. Sitting by the window that evening, I traced the shadows of the trees onto the carpet and let my mind settle on what came next. Lena had assumed victory, but the game had only just begun. And in the quiet, I felt the first thrill of something that had been missing since Daniel passed, the certainty that I would not be humiliated again. And for the first time in days, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The next morning, the sound of the doorbell startled me again, but this time it was a welcome interruption. Nancy stood there, her arms carrying a basket of warm bread and a gentle calm that always seemed to follow her. "I brought you something," she said softly, her eyes scanning my face as if searching for the shadow Lena had left behind. I took the basket with a small smile, feeling the weight in my chest ease just a fraction. "Thank you, Nancy. It means a lot." We settled in the kitchen, sunlight slipping across the wooden floor, and for the first time in days, I felt heard without judgment. Nancy had a way of speaking that didn't demand answers, didn't try to fix me, but simply reminded me of my own strength. "You know," she said, setting the basket down, "people like Lena, they thrive on control, but that control is only as strong as you let it be." I nodded, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with a trembling finger. "I feel like she's everywhere, Nancy, even when she isn't." "I can't shake it." Nancy leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on mine. "That's because she's trying to scare you. Make you doubt yourself. But you have something she doesn't: memory, clarity, and the courage to act quietly. Let her show her cruelty. You don't have to answer it with loudness. You just need patience." Her words settled over me, soft but firm like a seed planted in fertile soil. I realized she was right. Every humiliation, every whisper, every glance of ridicule could be used, not to hurt her in return, but to remind myself of what I was capable of. I could observe, learn, and move without shouting, without showing her that she had shaken me. We talked then, quietly, about small things: Daniel's old garden gloves, the cafe he loved on Main Street, the little rituals that made our days feel like hours. But even in these soft conversations, I felt the beginnings of a plan forming, subtle and deliberate. Lena had tried to break me, but in doing so, she had revealed her own arrogance, her own predictability. And that was where power lived, quietly, in patience and observation. When Nancy left, I didn't feel weak. I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt since the funeral, a small, steady flame of purpose. I walked through the house, noticing details I had missed before. The slight unevenness of a picture frame, the spot where sunlight caught the floor just so, the sound of the wind brushing against the window pane. Everything seemed alive, offering clues, offering the quiet opportunity to reclaim my space, my life, and my dignity. And I knew, as I traced my finger along the edge of Daniel's favorite chair, that the work of quiet justice was beginning. Lena thought she had won the first battle. She had no idea the war would be measured not in loud words or dramatic gestures, but in patience, careful attention, and the subtle reclaiming of every small corner of my life she had tried to steal. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe deeply and smile. The road ahead was long, but I was ready. I couldn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, but every creak of the floorboards sounded like Lena's whisper, every shadow a mocking reminder of the funeral. I found myself drawn to Daniel's study, the one place that still smelled like him: old books, cedar, a faint trace of his cologne. I ran my fingers along the shelves, letting the familiar textures anchor me. And then, tucked behind a stack of papers, I saw a small envelope, worn at the edges, in Daniel's unmistakable hand. I hesitated, heart pounding. Inside was a single note: "Observe. Trust yourself. The quiet path leads to truth." His words felt like a hand on my shoulder, steadying me, reminding me of the strength he always saw in me. I clutched the note, feeling warmth spread through my chest, and for the first time since the funeral, my pulse slowed. Lena had thought she could break me, humiliate me. But the truth, Daniel's truth, reminded me. That power didn't need to be loud. It could be quiet. It could be deliberate. I looked around the study more carefully, really seeing it for the first time in days. The papers on the desk weren't just scattered. They told a story of habit and routine, the small movements of a household lived in for decades. A coffee stain on the corner of a bill, a pen lying just slightly off its tray, the faint scratch on the floor near the window, they were all subtle patterns, moments that revealed the rhythm of the house and the blind spots Lena would never notice. Sitting in Daniel's chair, I imagined her arrogance, the way she thrived on spectacle. She would never anticipate subtlety, patience, or observation. And as I pictured her, I felt a faint thrill, not from anger, but from clarity. This wasn't about revenge in the ordinary sense. It was about reclaiming what she thought she could own: my space, my dignity, my peace. Every small act could be a statement. Every quiet move a message. She might not see it coming, and that was the power of it. I spent hours tracing the lines of the room with my eyes, memorizing the play of light across the floors, the angle of the windows, the way sound traveled from one corner to another. Every detail was a potential advantage. The humiliation of the chapel still burned, yes, but it had transformed into something precise, almost surgical. I realized that patience, calm, and observation could be more dangerous than any loud confrontation. When I finally left the study, the note still clutched in my hand, I felt something awaken inside me. Lena had underestimated me, and that underestimation was my first ally. The quiet path Daniel had written about wasn't just advice, it was a strategy. And slowly, deliberately, I would learn the steps. The house was still hers to enter, but I was no longer just a victim. And that, I realized, would make all the difference. The next morning I moved through the house with a precision I hadn't felt in years. Every step, every glance, every small adjustment of a picture frame or a vase felt deliberate, purposeful. It was as if the walls themselves were listening, noting the change in my rhythm. Lena might have thought she could intimidate me with loud words or gestures, but I was discovering a new kind of power, quiet, steady, unstoppable. I heard the familiar crunch of her heels on the walkway outside and froze for a moment, letting her arrive on her own terms. She appeared in the doorway, all smiles and clipped courtesy, holding a tray of cookies that smelled faintly of almonds. "I baked these for you," she said, voice sweet, but edged with that subtle superiority she always wore like perfume. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone calm, measured. I took the tray from her, letting my fingers brush hers briefly, a touch that was polite, neutral, and utterly in control. "They look wonderful." She lingered, as if expecting me to stumble, to react, but I didn't. I watched her carefully, noticing the little tells how. She tapped her fingers when she was impatient, the way her eyes darted toward the living room before settling back on me. Small details, but enough. Observation was a weapon I could wield, quietly. "I thought we could talk," she said, lowering her voice as though confiding a secret. "About the funeral and family matters." I smiled faintly, keeping my voice soft but firm. "I think we can wait," I said. "I need a little time to settle. Things have been difficult." The truth was, yes, they had been difficult, but that difficulty was sharpening me, teaching me patience, attention, subtlety. Lena might have thought she had all the control, but in reality I was learning how to anticipate her moves, how to stay calm while she fumed in polite frustration. When she left, I set the tray down and let out a slow breath, feeling the quiet thrill of small victories. Each interaction was now a study, a test, a rehearsal. I began keeping mental notes. Her habits, her preferences, her weaknesses, all invisible threads I could use when the time came. And the thought of that time arriving, of showing her that humiliation could be met with quiet, patient power, made my chest tighten with anticipation. I wandered into the kitchen, touching the edge of Daniel's favorite mug, remembering the calm clarity he had left me in his note. "Observe, trust yourself. The quiet path leads to truth." I repeated it silently, letting it sink into every nerve, every thought. Lena would learn soon enough that the storm she had tried to provoke was not loud or wild. It was patient, careful, and utterly inevitable. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to smile, not a triumphant smile, but one of quiet satisfaction, a hint of a plan taking shape in the stillness of the house. By the end of the week, I had begun noticing patterns in Lena's behavior, small things that revealed her impatience and need for control. She would rearrange the cushions on the sofa just so, straighten the curtains with exaggerated care, leave dishes slightly out of place, tiny tests, I realized, to see if I would react, and I didn't. I watched her from the corner of my eye, letting her think she still had the upper hand, while quietly mapping each gesture, each habit. One afternoon she appeared at the door with a basket of laundry, her smile tight, her words measured. I thought I'd help with some things. Make it easier for you. I accepted the basket, feeling the weight of her expectations in my hands. Thank you, Lena. That's thoughtful of you, I said softly, letting my calm tone hang in the air, unshakable. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if surprised I hadn't flinched. You've been quiet, she said, trying to sound casual. Is everything all right? I met her gaze steadily. Everything is fine. I've just been reflecting. Reflection, a word that sounded passive, almost gentle, but it carried with it an invisible sharpness. I let the pause linger, letting her imagination fill in the rest. After she left, I placed the laundry down and walked slowly through the living room, noting how her footsteps echoed differently on the floor, the way she had brushed her fingers along the edge of the coffee table as if marking territory. Each detail, subtle as it was, gave me information, a blueprint of her pride, her arrogance, her need to dominate even the smallest space. I realized then that patience was more than just waiting, it was learning. Observing, collecting quiet knowledge, so that when the time came, Lena wouldn't see my move until it was too late. The idea of subtle, untraceable influence thrilled me. Every gesture I made, every decision I took, became part of a larger rhythm she couldn't anticipate. I paused by the window watching the neighbors walk past, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding within these walls. And I thought of Daniel's words again, of his note. The quiet path often leads to justice. I let the weight of that truth settle in my chest. Lena thought she had won the opening act, the loud spectacle at the funeral. But the main performance, the one I was orchestrating carefully, deliberately, invisibly, had yet to begin. And for the first time I felt a strange, calm excitement. The humiliation had not destroyed me. It had honed me, sharpened me, and given me a clarity I had not felt in years. Lena would see it soon enough, but by then it would be too late for her to respond. The day began with an almost painful quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug, feeling the steam rise like a promise. Lena was already in motion somewhere in the house, her presence a subtle pressure I could almost taste, like iron in the air. I let her think she had the morning, let her believe she still controlled the rhythm of the house. She appeared at the kitchen doorway, with that practiced smile, carrying a tray, with a single, steaming plate. I thought you might like some breakfast, she said, voice polished, careful, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked to mine, calculating. I met her gaze steadily, and for a long moment, silence filled the room like a living thing. Thank you, Lena, I said softly, letting the calm stretch. I'll eat here. Her smile faltered, just slightly, and I caught the micro-expression, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. She had expected anxiety, reaction, maybe even fear. She got calm, quiet, deliberate calm, and in that stillness I felt a strange thrill. I carried my mug to the window, letting her watch me, unhurried, as sunlight caught the rim of the cup. Each movement was intentional, each breath slow. Every gesture, no matter how small, was a claim. She flinched once as I reached over to straighten a napkin on the table, a movement so ordinary it seemed invisible, yet it carried meaning. I was telling her without a word that I was not hers to shake. Later, I passed the living room and noticed her crouched by the sofa, rearranging cushions again. She looked up as I moved past, her eyes sharp. "You don't need to be so meticulous," she said, voice pitched as a suggestion but carrying the edge of control. I smiled faintly, my fingers lingering over the edge of the armrest. "Some things deserve attention," I replied, soft but firm. "Even small things can matter." Her lips pressed into a thin line, a flash of irritation, almost invisible, but it was there. And I understood something important. Patience was my weapon, observation my ally, and every tiny movement I made, every measured step, was now part of a larger invisible plan she could not yet see. That evening, I sat in Daniel's chair, tracing the light across the floorboards, imagining her next moves, predicting her little tests, her attempts at dominance, and I felt it, a quiet, steady excitement, a thrill that came not from anger or revenge, but from the clarity of knowing I was no longer powerless. Lena might think she had the upper hand, but she had already given me the blueprint of her arrogance, and in that realization, I felt the first true taste of control, and I knew the game had only just begun. I waited until the house was still, the kind of stillness that made every creak, every shuffle, feel amplified. Lena was moving through the room somewhere, humming softly, arranging things as if she owned not just the furniture, but the very air. I carried a small tray of cookies I'd baked the day before, letting the smell of vanilla and cinnamon fill the kitchen. The warmth of it grounded me, gave me a rhythm I could hold on to. She appeared at the doorway, hands resting on her hips, smile tight. "Oh, you baked?" she asked, voice sweet, but with that edge I knew too well. I could have done that. I met her gaze evenly, letting the silence stretch a fraction longer than comfortable. "Yes," I said softly, placing the tray on the counter. "And it's yours to share or not." Her eyes flicked down to the cookies, then back up, scanning me as if she were looking for a sign of weakness. I held none. "You're quiet today," she said, lowering her voice. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," I replied, calm, almost gentle. "I've just been paying attention." Her brow lifted, suspicion and curiosity mixing. I could see the moment her mind tried to calculate what I meant. That moment, so brief, yet so telling, was a victory. She thought she controlled the environment, the space, the narrative, but I was beginning to see it differently. Every gesture, every glance, every footstep was a thread in a pattern I was quietly weaving. Later, I moved deliberately around the living room. I left the cushions slightly off-center, allowed a book to rest face up instead of closed, tilted a small vase ever so slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Yet when Lena entered the room, her sharp eyes caught it immediately. She adjusted, frowned, muttered under her breath. And I watched, heart steady, letting her frustration bloom in private, letting her think the control still belonged to her. I began timing her reactions, noting the micro-expressions, the flicker of irritation when a chair wasn't perfectly aligned, the quick glance at a crooked frame, the slight bite of her lip when her assumptions didn't hold. Each one was a clue, a puzzle piece. And each piece gave me leverage I didn't need to explain, shout, or justify. Sitting in Daniel's chair that evening, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The humiliation, the scarf, the laughter, they had carved a scar. Yes, but now that scar was a map I could use to navigate, to reclaim, to build a quiet but unshakable power. Lena had made the first mistakes. I was learning from them. And the thrill of knowing the game had truly begun, that the quiet strategy was unfolding, settled deep in my chest like a slow, steady flame. By mid-morning, I noticed the first real signs of Lena's frustration. She moved through the house with slightly sharper gestures, her footsteps more hurried, her smiles tighter, more forced. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for lunch, and I felt her presence behind me before I even heard her. "Did you move the chairs again?" she asked. Voice tight, clipped. "Yes," I said softly, without looking up. They seemed more balanced this way. She froze for a heartbeat, clearly unprepared for a simple, calm answer. Then her eyes darted around the room, searching for other errors, other small disturbances she could correct, control, and use to assert dominance. But I had learned to anticipate, to act in ways that were subtle, deliberate, invisible. And every adjustment I made now was like a quiet conversation with her, a message she didn't realize she was receiving. I was not hers to manipulate. Later, she tried again, placing a vase in what she considered the perfect spot on the table. I approached slowly, letting my fingers brush the petals as if by accident, tilting it ever so slightly. She noticed instantly, her lips pressed together, a flash of annoyance, almost anger. "Why would you?" she began, but stopped herself mid-sentence, clearly debating whether to escalate or retreat. I smiled faintly, calm, measured. "I thought it caught the light better this way," I said softly. No apology, no confrontation, just quiet assertion, a subtle claiming of the space she had tried to dominate. By evening, the tension was palpable. I could hear her pacing in the living room, muttering under her breath, rearranging, testing, adjusting, desperate to regain a sense of control she had never truly possessed. I sat quietly by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor, feeling a slow thrill settle into my chest. Every small victory, every micro-expression of irritation or confusion was a confirmation. The quiet strategy was working. And as the house fell silent once more, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The humiliation, the laughter at the funeral, the scarf ripped from my head, they had all seemed so devastating at the time. But now, each moment had become a guidepost, a lesson, a subtle blueprint for action. Lena had given me the tools, and I had taken them. The real realization hit me then, a slow, shivering clarity. She didn't know I was winning yet. She thought the game was hers to play, but the pieces were shifting under her hands, and the quiet, inevitable revelation of that fact was going to be exquisite. That morning I decided it was time to move beyond observation. The house felt alive with tension, each corner echoing with Lena's subtle, frustrated energy. I carried a stack of letters to the study, letting the rustle of paper and the creak of the floorboards announce my presence just enough for her to notice. She looked up from the living room, a question hanging in the air, but I didn't answer. I simply placed the letters on the desk with careful precision, straightening each one, aligning them in a way that made the room feel under my control. "You're very particular, aren't you?" she said, voice tight, forced casual. Her hands were on her hips, but I could see the tiny tremor in her fingers, a subtle betrayal of impatience. "I prefer things to be orderly," I replied softly, calm, unshaken. "It makes decisions easier, don't you think?" Her lips pressed together as she studied me, trying to measure what I meant. But I had already begun planting small tests, minor obstacles, gentle consequences that she couldn't anticipate. The vase slightly off-center, a note left where she would find it, a drawer subtly rearranged each, one invisible to anyone else but unmistakable to her. I was guiding her, like water following the contours of a channel, shaping her frustration without ever raising my voice. Later, I saw her attempt to correct a minor imperfection in the living room. I paused by the doorway, observing her carefully, letting the silence stretch. "You don't need to fuss over it," I said softly, almost conversational. She looked up startled, as if she hadn't expected me to speak. "It's fine," I continued, voice calm, deliberate, perfectly fine. Her eyebrows lifted, confusion flickering in her eyes. She hesitated, then adjusted the object only halfway, clearly unsettled. And in that pause, I felt a quiet thrill, the first tangible proof that my subtle interventions were working. She was beginning to lose confidence in the control she thought she had, without ever realizing I had orchestrated the shift. By evening, I sat in Daniel's chair, tracing the patterns of sunlight across the floor. The small victories of the day, invisible to anyone else, settled over me like a warm blanket. Each subtle move, each deliberate pause, was a part of a larger strategy, a slow, graceful reclamation of the life and space Lena had tried to dominate. The humiliation, the laughter, the scarf, those moments were no longer wounds. They were lessons, tools, and now instruments of quiet justice. And deep in my chest, I felt a steady pulse of anticipation. Lena had no idea that the quiet storm had begun, and when it reached her, it would be inevitable, precise, and entirely deserved. By late afternoon, Lena's frustration had become almost palpable. I could hear the sharp scrape of her heels across the hardwood, the faint rustle of her fingers over surfaces, as if she were trying to erase invisible mistakes I had left in her path. I was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables with deliberate slowness, letting each sound, the knife against the board, the faint clink of the cutting edge reach her ears. She paused at the doorway, folding her arms, lips pressed tight. "Why do you insist on doing things your way?" she asked, voice tight but careful, like she was testing me, pushing for a reaction. I set the knife down gently, fingers lingering on the handle. "Because this is my home too," I said softly, letting the words settle in the space between us. And sometimes small changes reveal truths that loud words never could. Her eyes flicked to the rearranged cushions on the sofa, the slightly off-center vase, the notes left in places she would notice, subtle reminders of her loss of control. She tried to mask her irritation, but the twitch in her jaw, the rapid blink of her eyes betrayed her. I watched in quiet fascination. Every flicker of anger, every hesitation, was confirmation that my strategy was working. Later I moved through the living room, arranging a few books, leaving a single candle burning in a way that cast long shadows across the floor. Lena noticed immediately. You're doing this on purpose," she said, voice sharper now, a tremor of real frustration creeping in. "I suppose I am," I admitted softly. Calm, deliberate, but it's not about control. It's about clarity. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She adjusted the candle, then paused, unsure of what else to touch. I could feel the shift, the subtle tension. I could feel the shift, the quiet anxiety creeping into her movements. For the first time she seemed unsure, as though the house itself had started following someone else's rhythm, someone who was patient, observant, and entirely in control. As night fell, I sat in Daniel's chair with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the shadows stretch across the room. Each minor victory, each quiet disturbance, had been like dropping a pebble into still water. The ripples were reaching her in ways she couldn't see, couldn't predict. And in that realization, I felt a slow, quiet thrill. The humiliation at the funeral, the scarf ripped from my head, the laughter, they had all become instruments of something larger, a patient, inevitable reclamation. And deep down, I knew the final act was coming. Lena was learning the hard way that quiet power, patience, and observation could topple even the loudest arrogance. The game was not over. Not by a long shot. And when the culmination arrived, it would be precise, elegant, and utterly undeniable. Lena was in the living room, straightening a picture frame for the third time, her hands trembling ever so slightly. I watched her, calm, as if nothing had changed, as if the chaos she felt was only her imagination. You moved this again," she said finally, voice tight, almost a whisper, eyes darting nervously. "I did," I replied softly, letting my calm fill the space like sunlight spilling across the floor. I thought it looked better this way. Don't you think clarity matters more than control? Her lips parted, searching for an argument, but none came. She realized in a slow, almost painful way, that every small disturbance, the tilted vase, the slightly off-center cushions, the subtle notes left where she couldn't miss them, was deliberate. She had been drawn into a game she hadn't even known she was playing. I walked past her, brushing my hand lightly over the back of the sofa, letting the contact linger, just enough to remind her that I was here, present, unshaken. "You've done your best," I said gently. "And I've done mine. But patience and observation always reveal what arrogance cannot." She froze, swallowing hard, her eyes wide with sudden comprehension. For the first time I saw her truly see me, not as the quiet, passive presence she had assumed, but as someone fully awake, fully aware, fully in control. Her frustration, her pride, her little games, they had all been visible to me from the start. And I had used them, gently, deliberately, to take back what had been mine all along. I moved to the window, resting my hands on the sill, watching the late afternoon light spill across the floorboards. The house was mine again. Not because I had shouted, argued, or demanded, but because I had been patient, because I had let the truth unfold quietly. Inevitably, Lena would remember today, and she would understand, silently, that control is never claimed by force. It is earned. A slow, satisfied warmth spread through me, not from revenge, but from clarity, from dignity restored, from the quiet satisfaction of seeing the pattern of arrogance unravel without a single raised voice. I whispered to myself, almost reverently, patience is the strongest power of all. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes silence teaches more than words. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. Maybe your voice will be next on her voice.